Welcome, guys, to the Coin Vigilante podcast today. So, today I'm pleased to present you the chair of the DigiByte Foundation, Hans Koning. Hans, welcome to the show today.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So, before we move on to talk about DigiByte and a few ideas that I want to ask you about, could you give the audience a little bit of your background and after that, how you got into DigiByte?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we only got half an hour, so I'll make it short, shall I? I've been involved in the DigiByte community for about 3 years, and I've been the chair of the DigiByte Foundation for well over a year now, which we incepted about a year ago now. I've been interested and passionate about the blockchain for about 5 to 6 years. And to me, it more or less started, obviously, when the Bitcoin really got some traction and people start investing in it and people start talking about it. But prior to that, actually before the launch of the white paper of Satoshi Nakamoto, I was already interested in how decentralized thinking and how technology could actually help us creating a new financial sort of freedom. So I've been listening and reading a bit of the work of Nick Szabo in the past. And so when the movement of the 1% movement started, and then the credit crunch came in 2008, which led ultimately also to the launch of the white paper of the Bitcoin, things sort of fell into place for me. So, okay, this is something I really need to know. This is something I want to understand, and this is something I want to be part of. And as the saying goes, the rest is history.
Okay, gotcha. So, obviously Bitcoin was a Kickstarter to your interest. So when you first when you were made aware of Bitcoin, what was your first thought? Like, was that like a light bulb type of thing where it hit you and you're like, whoa, this is like the next new thing. I got to do something with this industry coming up.
No, it wasn't a typical light bulb moment that I heard of it and had to jump into it. No, it wasn't. For me, it was more of slowly and gradually. I became aware of it. I started to follow it. I started to read it. And then, after you think, okay, this is something that has a community, it's being spoken about, and I see the validity of the concept and the validity of the thinking, then that for me was sort of the moment that I said, okay, I want to be part of this movement and also want to own a few Bitcoins, which is actually quite a funny thing to say because not a lot of people can say, I owned a few Bitcoins. You can't say that now anymore. That brings you in a completely different bracket. But in them days, Bitcoin was obviously less appreciated than it is now. But for me, it was sort of gradually. I was aware of it. I kept following it. And after a while, I sort of, jumped in. But apart from the financial component, I like to think anyway, that for me, it was also more of the movement and the idea behind it of Bitcoin and decentralization and of a new way of thinking and a new way of organizing and structuring our communities and also organizing transactions, which are at the core of what we do and or at the core of our economies.
Okay, so you clearly you have an interest and you see opportunity in decentralization and what Bitcoin can do. So how did DigiByte come into place? And if you could explain to the audience, because a lot of the people I talk to, primarily it's either Litecoin, Bitcoin, you know how it goes, right? So, my audience needs to just be more aware of what DigiByte is. What does it do? What problems does it solve?
That's an excellent question, Carlos, and I'm more than happy to talk about that. Well, let's talk a little history. DigiByte is actually quite an old coin already compared to some of the newer coins. It's been around for 7 years, just over 7 years, which makes it almost like an established coin, if you like. It's also a coin because it has its own blockchain. DigiByte was founded by Jared Tate in 2013, and the coin ultimately launched in January of 2014. And Jared wanted an answer of some of the shortcomings he had seen in Bitcoin. Bitcoin was relatively slow, was sluggish, and the transactions were relatively expensive even then. And Jared felt there had to be a better way in transacting with each other on a faster and a more secure and an easier accessible blockchain, hence the birth of DigiByte. Now, when you look at DigiByte, a lot of people actually ask, so what does it do? Well, that's actually a really good question, and it more or less has 4 or 5 different pillars. I think the first one is obviously the DigiByte coin, and in my view, it's one of the ultimate merchants token. It has a lot of liquidity. It's listed on a lot of exchanges, and it's an ultra fast to use coin. The second pillar we have is authentication. So you can actually use DigiID, for instance, rather than using passwords. You can use DigiID to get access to your websites or to your wallets. So you don't have a centralized way of storing your passwords, but you have a decentralized solution for accessing your tools and your services. The third one is used for proof of authenticity. So it can be used for documents, for instance. So it can verify and authenticate whether a document is actually original or not. And the fourth pillar we have is the Digi assets, and those are the simple form of smart contracts we have in a moment. So tokenization is the fourth pillar, and tokenization is one of the things that's really going to take off. And I think NFTs, for instance, will be one of the big trends in this year. And I'm sure we have a little time at the end to talk about what lies ahead in token and crypto world. And fifthly, it is DeFi, the buzzword of 2020, and also DigiByte jumped into the DeFi space, and we're currently on the bridge with the REN protocol, which makes liquidity and hybridization a lot easier for coins.
Okay.
So that's it in a nutshell. So we actually do a lot already.
Yeah. So, and to be honest, I never really knew a whole lot about DigiByte. It's actually my mother who's like, always talking about it, and she got me into it, and well, she's like, well, when I first talked to her, it only seemed to me like it's only like, for example, Litecoin. Litecoin is, the Litecoin Foundation really strives to make it kind of like a medium of exchange, right? We want it to be for payments. And so that's kind of what I think about Litecoin. Now, for DigiByte, I thought about it in the same manner, in that, okay, well, DigiByte is faster. It's also secure, but it seems like you guys, really focus on the fast part, like the fast transactions. And so to me, I always thought, well, it's just gonna, it's just a method of payment, a quick method of payment. But it seems like you guys are working on a bunch of other things that are you guys are incorporating. And so, see, I never knew that. So are you saying that, so is DigiByte actually scalable enough to the point that you can incorporate all of these different projects into it? I mean, you were talking about, okay.
Yeah, absolutely it is. But I'm glad you actually touched on that point, as we're not, I'm not saying that Litecoin or Bitcoin is a one-trick pony. I'm not dismissive of any other project, so please don't interpret that the wrong way. DigiByte is one of the coins that actually wants to do more, and we feel it is important that we need to bridge towards real-life use cases. And having a fast merchant coin is crucial. It's very important in the space of transactions. But we do feel there are more use cases for blockchain authentication, authenticity, tokenization, DeFi. There are lots of other areas where the blockchain can be of really, really good use. And we feel that the DigiByte blockchain has to be part of that space because of its pure properties of being cheap, being fast, and being secure.
Okay, all right. So that's pretty interesting. See, I was not made aware of that. So hey, good thing I have you on the show, so I can teach myself about this and the audience. And so, one thing that I've seen, and I don't know if it was through DigiByte, I was seeing a bunch of videos, or I was seeing that the Hispanic community, or in Venezuela or somewhere, there's a growing community of DigiByte holders and users in Latin America. And I don't know if it's because it's the remittances things where, they're trying to send or transfer value across countries, which they're not allowed to do with their own currency or something like that. Is that accurate, or am I looking at a different thing, or what's going on?
No,
there?
No, that's absolutely true, and it's not because of my Spanish linguistic skills. Unfortunately, I don't speak two words of Spanish. Unfortunately, otherwise I would have loved to, really show off now and switch to fluent Spanish. And unfortunately, I cannot. My apologies for that. But yes, there are actually two components which really strike in your question, Carlos. First of all, the community aspect. DigiByte is by its core a community-driven blockchain project. We are all Satoshis, we are all DigiByte, we are all part of the decentralization, and we are the community. And as a community, we bring this project forward, and we do that from all different roles, as investors, as developers, as community experts, as marketing experts. We all chip in and help promote and develop our blockchain. We do that in so many different ways, and people from all walks of life actually do that. We also see that specifically a fast transactable coin is really used in countries where there is, let's say, sometimes a bit of a reluctance in using the traditional fiat system. Not everyone has access to a bank account. Not everyone trusts bank accounts. So in areas in Africa and Asia and Latin America, we do see that people actually move towards blockchain and move towards crypto to do payments. And DigiByte, for instance, if I transfer you DigiByte, it is visible within your wallet in 1 second. It is confirmed within 15 seconds. So that is an ultra fast way of actually transacting. So you can actually do literally peer-to-peer with two phones held together. You can actually see that the transaction has been completed and has been confirmed. So that makes it, for a lot of countries, a perfect project and a perfect coin to use as an alternative to fiat, for whatever reason there might be. There might be in some countries, well, you mentioned Venezuela, for instance, hyperinflation is a big issue. The local currencies, you need to spend it, and you need to spend it straight away. Otherwise, it loses its value. Therefore, cryptos can be a really alternative, and especially if you combine it with reliability of the network, fast transaction, and cheap transactions, it becomes a really good alternative. So yes, we do see traction in the Latin America, but also in Africa, Nigeria, for instance, and also pockets in Asia where people are also using DigiByte as an alternative to fiat currencies.
But see, that's interesting.
And we applaud that, actually, because part of our thinking within the DigiByte community is it's for the people, by the people. So if people actually really use it, that's the ultimate compliment to your blockchain project. So we feel that's actually a really nice development, Carlos.
Okay, so but that's interesting, and that brings me to another point. It seems to me, for some reason, that people in areas where there's hyperinflation and they're seeing a massive devaluation of their purchasing power, that they actually seem to start understanding more what DigiByte is, what blockchain is, and what cryptos are. And it's because they're in a position where they have to seek an alternative. And
Correct.
in the United States, for example, if I talk to average people, or I try to introduce them to Bitcoin, they just don't seem to grasp the idea, or not even want to understand. And it's because I think there's some sort of complacency in at least first world countries, where we've been living nice and secure, our currency is doing okay, this and that. But then the people in Latin America, Africa, Asian countries, where they're seeing their currency being ripped apart, it's almost as if they're starting to understand it a bit sooner than we are, and we're seeing more adoption happening
Correct.
in those countries than actually here. And I think see, the interesting part here is I and I might be wrong, but my idea is, now that I'm thinking about it, a lot of people in the US are getting into Bitcoin only because number goes up. That's it.
Correct. Yeah.
On the other hand, we have people that are actually using it because they're seeing the use case and they need it. And so I think that's a very interesting point. And I mean, what do you think? I mean, do you think there's some
Yeah,
truth in that? What I'm saying?
absolutely. I don't think you could have phrased it any better, Carlos. Kudos the way you phrased it. Absolutely, I totally agree with that. And one thing is that necessity is the mother of all driving things forward. And if that is really a need for you to prevent a devaluation and really have the value of your currency guaranteed, as well as having access to your currency guaranteed, that drives necessity and therefore drives uses. But another thing, and which you hinted towards, is that at the core of all this is decentralization, and decentralization is by default a bottom-up movement. It's not a centralized, from some sort of government or some sort of officials coming up with the idea, and it disperses and it trickles down to our society. Decentralization is by default the other way around. It goes from the bottom. It's a bottom-up movement, and that's also, I think, in countries where there's not necessarily a lot of trust in the ecosystem or the infrastructure, then you also are going to look for alternatives. And decentralization, blockchain, will be an alternative and has to be an alternative to that. So that's also an area why we see, from a social, economic adaptation, and psychological adaptation perspective, we see decentralized projects really taken off.
So yeah, so that's interesting. So I was talking to the Zilliqa co-CEO just the other day, and we're talking about DeFi and how decentralization is basically going to be the new industry and the new way in which we
Yes,
kind of do everything. And
correct.
whether it comes to payments, whether it comes to tokenization, which Colin Miles explained it very well. All of these things, we're going to start moving away from centralized fashion into decentralized and taking the middleman out. Now, what are your thoughts on that? So we have already well established companies and organizations that can do much of this in a centralized manner, right? They're
Correct.
established, they're publicly
Yes.
traded, they're backed by the current political whatever, right? And so, do you see decentralized, like this whole decentralized industry taken over completely or coexisting side by side? And I mean, what do you think about that?
I think that's a really good and interesting question, and not a question that can be answered really easily. There are a couple of sides to your question. Ultimately, I think deep down, 100% decentralized society is perhaps also not the utopia we should strive for. I don't know why, but sometimes I think you need to have a certain balance. So yes, I do think there will be room for decentralization, and there will be room for decentralization a lot. But ultimately, there will be some sort of level of
Yeah.
centralized entities around, and that's perhaps also for the better. Perhaps only be it to appreciate decentralization a bit more. But ultimately, and I think that's what we all need to remember, is why do we actually flock towards decentralization? And to me, it all boils down to one word, and that's trust, or better said, the lack thereof. The lack of trust is unfortunately ingrained in our society. We don't trust politicians, we don't trust judges, we don't trust the police, we don't trust the media, we don't trust our neighbors, we don't trust influencers, we don't trust anyone anymore. So there is a deep sense of distrust in our society. So disintermediation, or taking away the middleman, is almost a consequence of that. Was banking in the 80s and the 90s just really convenient, and you wouldn't think about whether you wouldn't think about twice about the reliability or the trustworthiness of a bank. Now, a lot of people actually do have a certain reservation when it comes to reliability of banks or of politicians or of their own governments. So the lack of trust is in my view, the deep thing that drives decentralization. And that also quickly want to come back to the white paper of Satoshi Nakamoto. In the perspective of when it was written in October, November of 2008, that was in the heart of the financial crisis, right? The banks had done the most bizarre things ever. They were dropping like flies left, right, and center. And guess what? We all bailed them out. And they're doing the whole shenanigans all over again. So it's trust, the lack of trust, that has driven us towards decentralization, and it shown us the side of disintermediation. So get rid of the middleman and do transactions peer to peer, how it always used to be before we had, like 100 years ago, everything was peer to peer.
Yeah, barter. I mean, that's how it used to be. You were just trading
Correct.
directly with a person without
Absolutely.
anyone in the middle.
Correct.
But see, to me, I like what you're saying, but it just kind of makes me mad to an extent, because a lot of people don't want to step out of their comfort zone and
Correct.
realize that the current system is not made for them. And so that's part of the reason why I make this podcast, because the few people that I reach, I want them to understand that we are finally having the opportunity to go to an alternative that is decentralized,
Yes.
where you don't need to trust anymore. Everything is verifiable. And so
Correct.
what is it that we need to do for people to start understanding? Or is it going to have to be a wake up call like 2008 type of thing, where shit hits the fan and they're like, oh yeah, now I get it. It looks like I need to start moving to something else. And so I don't know. I guess it's maybe a slow process in which people start slowly transferring into the system. Or is there any way that we can just get the message across and get people to realize, hey, banks screwed us in 2008. The government, I just saw a movie last night. It's the Snowden movie on Netflix.
Yeah.
It blew my mind. And basically, I don't know what your views are on Snowden, but regardless of what happens, the fact is the government has been spying on us, every single person in the world, without your own approval. Privacy rights are out of the picture. And so, what is it that's going to have to happen for people to start understanding this system that we live in is unsustainable. It doesn't respect our purchasing power. It doesn't respect our effort that we put in our 9 to 5 by holding our cash, right? What is it? I mean,
well, actually, it's quite funny you mentioned the Snowden example. And if I were to be really cynic, I could say, the government wants to spy on me, so why should I trust my government, right? If you're really cynic, you would say, yeah, it's no wonder that people actually, turn away from governments, or have an issue with trust, or have an issue with authority, because our own government not necessarily trusts us for what it's worth. But when it comes to a big wake-up call, yes, it could very well be an event. Usually a cataclysmic event will lead to a massive change. What we see with COVID, for instance, could that be the big reset trigger that will happen? Who knows? But for me, I'm not going to wait for a cataclysmic event, because I prefer not to do that. For me, it's important to make sure that everyone understands the concept of decentralization, and I guess that's why I always enjoy being on podcasts so much, and really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about it, because we need to make sure that blockchain is really for the people and by the people. So it needs to be low barrier. It's not a really complicated cryptographic protective technological algorithm. No, it is something for you and it is something for me. It is a peer-to-peer service we can use. I honestly am not that involved or vested in the technology. I know it's there. I value it, but for me, the crucial component is that you and I can use it whenever we want, wherever we want, however we want. And to me, that's the message that should be really important, that blockchain technology and cryptos are for you and are for me or for us to use where we want, how we want, when we want. So it's for the people and by the people. And that's one of the key issues we like to drive on always within the DigiByte Foundation and within the DigiByte community. So for me, not necessarily am I waiting for the cataclysmic event to happen, but try to advocate more or less that it's for us, and it's not something threatening. It's something that can enhance your life. If you don't want to use it, up to you, not a problem whatsoever, but be aware that there is an alternative. That's more or less why we want to work within the DigiByte Foundation towards adaptation and awareness of blockchain.
And see, that's interesting because you talk about the message. Look, we're not trying to make it, it's a low barrier entry to where we're not trying to talk big names and, complex topics and things like that. I was listening to a podcast or interview between Raul Paul and Dan Tapiero, and that was about, I don't know, 5 months ago. And basically, both of them clearly understand Bitcoin is the way out. Bitcoin is going to have much appreciation for the time to come. But then, Dan Tapiero was saying, well, you realize that if you want to start convincing actual institutions to get a hold of Bitcoin, you have to work on the message. Actually, I don't know if it was Michael Saylor or Dan Tapiero. One of the others said that. It's like, we need to start focusing more on the message and stop saying, you know how Bitcoin maximalists are. They're very religious almost about Bitcoin, right? And so in a way, it's about the message too, right? They have very complex topics about Bitcoin and what they do, but like you said, it needs to be a low barrier entry. Institutions are going to get it, but we also need to work on our message that we use to get the average Joe into coming into this opportunity and decentralization. And so I think you guys, as I'm talking to you, the way you're speaking, you're doing a great job with that. And it's good that we have, foundations, right? The DigiByte Foundation, that is, doing this in a down to earth mentality, like you said, from bottom up. And so I think we need to strive to, whether we're doing podcasts, whether we're talking to average people, to not say, well, the cryptographic type of thing of Bitcoin and then the mining with the proof of work and then this and that and that and that and that. That's how Bitcoin. No, we need to start trying to do it down to earth. And I think that's how I see it. But okay, so moving.
Can I expand on that? Because one thing you actually triggered me when listening to you, Carlos, and it was also as a foundation, we were actually incepted as a foundation. We were set up as a foundation to make sure that we also had a almost a legitimate voice for DigiByte to the real world, because this expression of if Muhammad doesn't come to the mountain needs to come to Muhammad, and it's still a bit with blockchain versus real world business. They need to be bridged, and as a foundation, we feel it's important that we make an effort, we make a step towards the real world business. And make sure that there are real use cases available for the business community at large. And let's say if you really like Bitcoin and you want to use Bitcoin for something, who are you going to call? There's no one to call. It's a decentralized project. No one owns Bitcoin. Same as DigiByte, we are a permissionless blockchain, but we wanted to make sure that people are interested in our technology, which has a lot of pillars and use cases, that we can actually facilitate that use. So as you said, low barrier use cases, make it accessible and make it understandable, and get away from red tape and hindrances and burdens, make it easy accessible. That's what the foundation actually strives to do.
That's perfect. And I think that's what we should all strive to do. So, moving aside just a little bit, just a few more questions.
Sure.
Moving aside from, just crypto alone, what are your thoughts on the current economy? So we have the Federal Reserve, we have banks all over the world printing trillions of dollars. And, this is something I always talk about, because with this printing, it's basically devaluing your purchasing power, right?
Correct.
And one of the things that I always talk about, I've done some research, and the top 10% of the United States own about 50% of all assets, whether that's real estate, whether that's commodities, whether that's equities, right? And on the other side, the bottom 50%, right? Myself, the average Joe included, right? We only own about 2 to 5% of assets. So what does that mean? The bottom 50%, the majority of things that they hold is cash, or maybe a mortgage or something like that. And so what we're seeing today is that the Federal Reserve saved the stock market and
Correct.
assets at the expense of the US dollar, whether they like to admit it or not. And that means they save the rich people over the little guy. I mean, it's just a pure fact. You cannot hide that. And so to me, I think the stock market is no longer a representation of the economy, right? When people celebrate, oh my gosh, the stock market is at all-time high, the economy is great.
Yeah.
They have no idea what they're talking about, because that
Correct.
is not true. There is an incredible wealth gap happening in one of the worst economic crises since the Great Depression. And so what are your thoughts on the whole like kind of macro about the printing going on and where we're standing
Yeah.
in the economy?
Yeah. Okay. Let me start with the stock market. I honestly agree. Yeah, I agree with you, and I honestly think that simply because the fact that money is being printed in quantities we have never seen before. Interest here in Europe, for instance, is zero or negative. So we have the TINA principle that's called there is no alternative. What do you need to do with your money? There is no alternative. You can't buy bonds. You can't put it on a bank account. You need to go to the stock market. You need to invest it. So that's the only reason why stocks continuously keep rising. And I agree with you, it's not a representation of the underlying economy. No, it is not. If COVID had seen as anything, that there are some extremely vulnerable companies, and what do we see? We see the stock prices just go up, and a company like Tesla has a profit earning ratio of almost like 1,000. I think it's a bizarre representation. Tina, there is no alternative, so you have to go into stocks, and we keep printing an unprecedented amount of money. So far alone, the Central Bank of America and the Central Bank of Europe have pumped, I think, $8.5 trillion into the economy. And to give you a perspective, at the peak about 2 weeks ago, when Bitcoin was at 56, 57,000, the market cap of all cryptos was $1.5 trillion. And now let that sink in, that the central banks in America and in Europe have printed 5 times that amount of money in the economy, just like that,
Out of thin
in
air.
2 months. Exactly. And they print it, and everyone gets a printer. Everyone gets free paper, and they come to your place to replace the cartridge. But the thing needs to keep printing. It's an extraordinary, unprecedented amount of money being poured into the economy. That will have an effect. It's inevitable. It will have an effect. And people say, well, the government need to pay it up at one point in time. Well, no, they don't, because it's more or less, well, the federal governments own the central banks ultimately, so they only give you an IOU to themselves. So what are they going to do? It's futile, but to keep printing money, and the system still, okay, there's money, so now we can do this. So that is simply unsustainable. And funny enough, I've written an article last year calling for a blockchain woods, and we had the Bretton Woods conference at the end of the Second World War, which resetted the financial system after the Second World War. So how monetary policy would unfold in this new world, and make sure that Europe wouldn't succumb to financial and economic peril as they did before the Second World War. Bretton Woods. We need to have a blockchain woods. We need to make sure that blockchain and decentralization is part of the discussion of a new organization, a new structure of our financial world. And yes, there will be something like central banks. I'm not I can't see a fully 100% decentralized project replacing central banks. That will not happen. But it has to be part of the debate. It has to be part of the equation, and it has to be part of the solution. There has to be time for a Bretton Woods conference. And I'm all for that, because the system as we have now is, in my view, not sustainable.
No, I mean, not at all. But I mean, if you're, let's say, Jerome Powell, or if you are the leader of a government, you
Yeah,
realize that, if you're in the government or you're a central bank, it's to your benefit that you keep just doing what you keep doing. Printing, printing,
correct.
printing. We love doing it, right?
Yeah,
It's our only way. But they see, I have a hard time believing that they're stupid enough to not realize that cryptocurrencies are kind of like the alternative, and the way in which the governments and banks lose some of that power of being of
correct.
using that system.
And that's
So,
precisely it. Yeah,
and
correct.
what are they?
That's
What I
precisely
mean,
it.
do you think they're going to fight it? Do you think the United States is not going to be in open arms to this new industry? Because look, I've been hearing, a lot of smart people talk, and Raul Paul like says, well, I find it very difficult that they would, go against it because, and other people are saying China is right now in open arms to kind of like blockchain, apparently. So,
Yeah.
it's almost as if, imagine if the United States said initially when the internet was coming up, yeah, we're not really going to do it. It's going to give power back to the people. We like how we're doing things. Well, it didn't happen. And if they would have
No.
done that, the United States would have been in a hole compared to any other nation that did accept it. So, what do you think? I mean, it is, crypto is really, it is a bit of a competitor in a way. I know it's going to coexist. One is not going to take over the other, but are they
No.
going to be in open arms? Is it going to be a slow, steady kind of like regulatory thing going on? Or what do you think?
Well, the thing is why banks or governments are reluctant for embracing cryptocurrency is simply for one reason and one reason only. That's you give away control. You can no longer monitor it, and you can no longer tax it. And I think that's also the most important thing. So they come up with all these almost eclectic kind of reasons. Oh, it's money laundering, it's fraud, it's kiddie porn, it's terrorism, it's everything is bad. But ultimately, it's about control, and losing control and losing the only reason why you still exist. And that's the threat for banks, for instance. All of a sudden, realize that you and I, we can transact, we can exchange houses, we can, with tokens, we can tokenize the whole economy. Everything we have, whether it's a watch or a house or shares, we can just tokenize it, and we can transfer it on the blockchain peer to peer. We don't need to go. We don't need a centralized stock exchange anymore. We don't need banks. We don't need notaries. That is a big threat for the establishment, if ever I saw one. So from that perspective, yes, I can definitely understand why they are, well, let's call it reluctant to embrace reality. And when it comes to governments, I think, not being able to tax it, to track transactions,
Right.
means that you can't put tax and levies on things. So therefore, all of a sudden, your business model is like a house of cards, gone. So yeah, I can understand that you come up with all these reasons, but the underlying, it's either you lose the reason you exist or you lose your money. So yeah, of course there are forces against crypto at the moment. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's funny enough, yesterday my sister asked, well, how is it possible that banks are not going to do anything they can to not let this happen? And I'm like, well, I think we're reaching a point where they can't stop it. The only thing is they can adapt and get their weeds within the system. And so, for example, like the OCC made a regulation, I think it was 6 months ago or something like that, saying that
Mhm.
federal chartered banks or something like that in the US can now hold digital currencies. That was like a
Yes.
huge, when I first heard that, I'm like, okay, it's going to be a big deal. And so that was my first buy signal. Like, I've been waiting, I've been holding cash, I'm getting in now. And so, in a way, I kind of foresee to where like JP Morgan Bank will be able to store your crypto in the future. I don't know when, because they want to they want to have your money in there. Now, I don't know if that would be so. I'm not an expert in this, but you know how, for example, if I go on Robinhood or something, I buy some stocks. I actually don't know if the stocks that I hold are actually there, right? Um,
No,
it's if it's in a blockchain, I would know for certain, right?
correct,
And
correct.
so my question is, if the banks, because now there's regulatory approval to an extent, if they can hold your Bitcoin, for example, if that ever happens where JP Morgan
Yeah.
has your Bitcoin, is there a way where that could be like paper Bitcoin and they actually don't own it? Or do you think they're actually going to have a blockchain, or it's going to be stored in the blockchain through JP? I don't know. I can't picture it in my mind. If that does that make
No,
any sense?
an interesting question, Carlos. I think when it comes to centralized exchanges or banks, the old paradigm within the blockchain community still exists, and that's not your keys, not your coins. So if you
Right.
don't own the keys, you don't own the coins. So if I have a couple of DigiByte placed in a wallet on an exchange, they're not mine, right?
Right.
I can access them via my password, but they're not mine. The keys are being owned by the exchange, so they're technically not mine. Not your keys, not your coins. And I think that's one of the paradigms that is very prevalent within the blockchain community. Do your own research, not your keys, not your coins. And I think that JP Morgan or other banks who definitely love to persuade us and saying, well, we can be the custodian, you can trust us. I think that a lot of people will, but there are also a lot of people who will actually take offense and would have their own wallet. And besides, I mean, what's the issue? What's the issue with owning your own wallet? I mean, people had wallets for hundreds, if not thousands of years. This is just an electronic type of wallet, but it's the same principle. It's in your pocket. It's yours. No one can touch it.
Yeah. And see, people find it so hard to understand that. Like right now, if I try to explain it to people, like my in-laws, right, my fiance, right, I'm trying to explain it to them. They're like, "Well, yeah, you told me to buy Bitcoin and Robinhood," and yeah, I'm like, "No, I didn't," right? And so you do not want to buy Bitcoin and Robinhood because you can't take it out. They're like, "Wait a minute, what do you mean
Yeah,
take it out? You can take it out?" So in their minds, it's a stock, right?
yeah,
And so
correct.
we have to just kind of try to educate people because they don't understand yet that you have the power to own the money, and it's within your own right and privacy to hold it,
Yeah,
and that's it. And it's kind of like a mind when you get that light bulb moment, you're like, wow, for the first
correct.
time, because everyone is programmed to think that everything has to go through a bank. That's how we've
Yeah,
been living for the past 30 years, 50 years,
correct.
right?
Yeah,
And so I think
correct.
that's a very interesting point, and people don't get it.
No, no. But when it comes to stocks, for instance, 100 years ago, people owned stocks, and it was literally like like a big diploma, and it was written and stamp on it, and
Yeah.
you literally owned stocks. And then banks said, well, would you like us to look after it because we have a vault? Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'll trust the bank. You pay a bit of money for that, and up until that became popular, more or less banks became custodians. And but was there any reason for it? No, not really. It was laziness, convenience. But now it's all electronic. There's
Yeah.
absolutely no need whatsoever to let someone else be the custodian of your assets. There isn't.
Right. Right. Gotcha. Okay, so let's wrap this podcast up. So
Yeah.
one thing. So I always ask my guests. So I'm gonna say one word or
Yeah.
a couple words, and you have to give a one word description whenever I
Okay.
give you. Okay. All right. So let's start with let's do Bitcoin.
Mother of all coins.
Okay. Um, stock market.
Passé.
Okay. Peter Schiff.
Stop smoking that crap. Now, one word. One word is educate yourself. Two words.
Okay.
Sorry. Two words.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's fine. DigiByte. DigiByte. Up?
Just a thumb up. Yeah,
Oh, just a thumb up.
yeah,
It's the right coin. All
yeah.
right. Okay, gotcha. And then so what is one of your favorite books that you've read or movies of all time that have given you just immense value to where like, man, if I wouldn't have read that book, I don't know if my life would be where I would be, all right? So some value that a book has given you or a movie.
Wow, that is such a difficult question, and the reason why that's difficult because I have definitely in the past and I still read a lot of books, and it's a bit like what's your favorite food that also can change a bit by season. I actually recently reread 1984 by George Orwell, and I still find that a riveting book. And the second is also by George Orwell. That's Animal Farm, and that's how that to me is more or less the parable of decentralization. You start with the right intentions, all being equal, and a utopian society, and slowly and gradually
Yeah,
you become something really horrific and dictatorial. And so I would say Animal Farm by George. Yes.
gotcha. And then I'm basically copycatting Anthony Pompliano, but do you think aliens exist?
No.
Okay, interesting. All right, gotcha. All right, well, Hans, it was a pleasure talking with you. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot about DigiByte, and we had pretty good discussion about the economy and
Yeah.
all that stuff. But again, I really appreciate you coming.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you for having us. And I always speak in the plural. That's not because I'm so important, but I represent a community of over 1 million people, DigiByte. I am, at this point in time, a bit of the voice of the DigiByte community, but we are all over the world from all walks of life. So on behalf of us, all of us, thank you for having us. And we look forward in connecting again. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to hear more about DigiByte. We
I'd
love
be,
being here.
yeah, I'd be more than happy to.